Today we have the privilege of having another one of our overseers. Pastor Micah Dalbey is going to share with us in just a moment. And for those of you that are new to Anchor or weren't here a couple weeks ago when one of our other overseers shared, I just want to let you know that we have a board of overseers, which is 3 pastors who are a role of authority and accountability within Anchor Church. We recognize as we planted this church now a little over 2 years ago, how important it is to have the proper structures. And as we just finished the book of Titus together, studying authority structures in the church really matter. And so one of the structures that is put in place is the overseers. On a day-to-day basis, they're not making day-to-day decisions for the church. They are a board of wisdom, of advice. I send out emails and questions and have meetings with them. And they're just a source of prayer, a source of advice, people who have been in ministry longer and more experience and just can speak wisdom into us as a church and as a leadership team. Should there ever be a time where the lead pastor, whether it's me or whoever lead pastors in the future, if there is anything that comes into question, whether it's morality, behavior, theology, finances, anything, the overseers are who are approached by the elders of the church. And if there is ever anything of concern for the lead pastor, the overseers then move into a role where they've got complete authority. If there should be any discipline, if there should be a firing, it's the overseers who have that role within the church. That there is authority, accountability right now for me or for whoever the lead pastor happens to be. So you get to hear from the people who can fire me. This is what it is. But much more than that, these are people who are so invested, not just in Anchor Church, but have displayed a faithful commitment to the Lord, faithful commitment to the Word, faithful commitment to the church. And we're so privileged to not just have Micah sharing with us here today, but to be a voice in this church. For those of you who don't know, Pastor Micah, he is the lead pastor of Missoula Alliance Church up on the hill. And Missoula Alliance Church, it's like the big brother we hope to become like someday. They are just so incredible, all the different ways that they love and they serve the Missoula community. And I just want to say that Micah and his wife Reese and the whole team up there has, from day one, you've been such an encouragement personally to us, so supportive as a church. The different ways that you guys have invested in us and encouraged and supported us. We still have a office up at Missoula Alliance Church where we have staff meetings and everything. And for over 2 years now, we've paid a grand total of $0. We bought them coffee once. We should probably do that again. We're a little late on rent. Next staff meeting, coffee on us. But just over the top generous and supportive of us. And so more than what happens on the stage today from him teaching, a voice of consistent faithfulness and encouragement to us as a church. And we're incredibly grateful and excited to hear from you today. This music stand is going to get higher than it's ever been before because I'm not as tall as Micah. That's really tall. It just kept going. I didn't expect it to be that tall. We're so privileged to have Pastor Micah. Church, would you stand to your feet and welcome and honor Pastor Micah Dalbey.
Good morning, everyone. That was very gracious, and thank you, Kyle. As you're going to hear in a minute, the feeling is very mutual. Even just being here for this short time and being reminded of the gospel of Jesus, that I'm not here because of some experience or some credentials or some training, but because of the mercy and grace of Jesus. That's how each of us are able to have any hope, is because of what Jesus did for us. And I'm so grateful to be reminded of that this morning, to gather with you all, to be prayed over, which is so powerful. My wife, Reese, Kyle mentioned, she is the Mac Kids, that's a little inside, the children's ministry director up at the church, and she is inundated this morning. So she was not able to be with us this morning, but she also is so grateful for this church. And you guys have an amazing pastoral and leadership team. And I'm not just saying that, God's hand is upon them. And when I'm here, I see, and you're going to hear this come out in what I have to share this morning, that the commitment to do what Jesus says, to be a church that Jesus says, I value these things. And I walk in here and I see these things that Jesus values being practiced. So there's a reason. It's not some accident that God's hand is upon Pastor Kyle and upon these leaders and upon this church. I see it. It's obvious to me. So, grateful to be here with you all today. We have 6 kids. 2 of them were able to come with me, and I think they're in the kids' classes this morning. But I wanted to start by sharing a verse that if you've been here with me sharing before, I've shared it a ton of times, and it's like our relationship verse. You know how couples have a song? Yeah, no? Yeah, okay, thank you. This is our verse, whether you like it or not, whether you just met me. Here you go. Philippians chapter 1, I love this. Paul says, he's writing to a church, a group of believers, and he says, I thank my God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. Now, I've known that verse. I grew up in church. I've heard that verse, known it my whole life. It's just been, God has attached it to you in my heart. And I don't remember when that happened, but I was like, that is my church. That is my verse for this church. I'm so grateful. And there is something special about partnering in the good news of Jesus. And Paul goes on, you may know the verse where he says, I'm sure of this, that he who began a good work in you individually, in you as a community, will be faithful to complete it. And the joy that comes from knowing this is Jesus' work, nothing is going to stop him building his church. And the joy that comes from knowing that I'm not alone in that work. I have partners. I have other people who are broken and blessed in this work. There's so much joy that comes up when I think of you all in light of these verses. We're partners. And I love how Paul doesn't say we're held together by our partnership in the geographical location in Missoula. We're held together by our partnership in how we voted, right? We are held together because of the gospel. The good news that Jesus lived the life we could never live. He came for you and me. He died for the sins we committed against him. The fact that he forgives constantly, he's cleansing, he's raising us to new life, he's preparing a place for us, and he's coming back to get us. And the gospel, what I wanted to talk about this morning that's just been on my heart, and I've asked the Lord to sort of bring out what he wanted me to share with you all this morning. The gospel isn't just news, it is the power of God to transform every part of our lives. I know you've heard that, and I know that maybe I think you've just been through a series talking about the gospel, but that's just, God's been pushing that into my heart, that if the gospel is just good news, we don't have much. But I'm sure you'd agree, we are inundated with news, and I was thinking about all of the information that was constantly coming at us. If the gospel is just information, we're never going to experience transformation. And I'm thankful that Paul in Romans chapter 1 says more about the gospel than just, hey, here's the information about God. You should believe that so that you can go to heaven. In Romans chapter 1, he's talking about how eager he is to preach the gospel in Rome, this place where he is certain to be criticized, where his message is bound to be ridiculed by the people there. And yet in spite of that reality and that knowledge, he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. Because, why? It is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. And again, in the church, sometimes salvation can be immediately interpreted to mean I get to go to heaven one day. It's not just that. That word salvation means total redemption. Total renovation, redemption, all things new in my life. That is what God has promised. He's personally invested himself through Jesus, his son, in your story. And he's inviting you to be involved in his. And so the Christian life is not a persona that we put on once a week where we smile and pretend that we're good. We can be broken because of what God has done. It's the power of God for every part of our lives. And I'm so thankful. That's why I'm so thankful for your partnership in the gospel. There's a quote I ran across and was reminded of how the gospel is the only hope for our country. It's the only hope for the brokenness in our lives. And I know that I'm supposed to say that because I'm a pastor and this is a church. But there was a great quote by Henry David Thoreau. He said, there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil for every one who is striking at the root. Anyone experience that? This common temptation to run around attacking the symptoms of sin in our own lives, in our culture. We're sort of snipping the heads off of weeds and saying, I think we're good now. Only the gospel deals with the root of the problem, not just repressing bad behavior, but renovating the human heart from which that behavior springs. And so I wanted to share this morning about what difference the gospel makes. What difference does it make? Beyond my sins are forgiven, everything we've just remembered today is absolutely essential. It is the foundation, but from that foundation, what really has changed in your life and in mine? That's, again, I'm sort of inviting you into my own process this morning. For example, is there a difference in the way that you interact with people that you disagree with compared to someone who doesn't have the gospel? How do you express yourself on social media? Is there a difference? What about the way you respond to sin and failure that shows up in your own heart or in someone else's life? Are we as quick to pick up and throw stones as the culture around us? Or does it matter that Jesus died on the cross for sins? Does that change us? Another one that was on my mind, what about your experience of joy and peace and hope? Not just the belief in it, not just I can give you a theological definition, but do you experience that? I love how we sang this morning, I'm glad, like the experience of gladness. And as I sang that, I'm like, asking myself, am I? Yes, I am, as we put our trust in him. But even how we feel should be transformed on some level. And I know this is getting a little bit personal. There's some resistance to talking about feelings, maybe the fear that we'll overemphasize, which is certainly a risk. But I was counting in the Bible this week how many references to joy and peace and hope, which if those aren't experiences, what are they? Right? They're not just words. And I found in the Bible, joy is referenced over 400 times. Peace is referred to in the New Testament alone almost 100 times. The word hope shows up 129 times. And as I was thinking about that, I thought, why is that? Because God cares about your experience of the fruit of his Spirit, which is what these things are. He cares about that. And it makes sense because how does good news make you feel? You can say it. Good. Good news makes you feel good. And this is the good news. There is no news better. How does that make you feel? I remember the first time I learned that I was going to be a dad. My wife told me and shared the news with me. And if I'm honest, I had a lot of feelings. My wife told me, and then she immediately took a picture of me. It was Christmas, actually, 15 years ago. And yeah, so I opened up this box and it's got all the baby stuff. And I was genuinely, I'm easy to surprise, I'll just put it that way. So I was looking through all the stuff and I was like, what? And then it hit me and she was like, so. It was mostly excitement. But if you were to measure my brain activity in that moment, my heart rate, do you think anything changed? Right, the gospel, the good news, and how much more the reality that Jesus died for our sins, that we are new, that we have hope that lasts beyond just this life and the things we can accumulate. It changes us. That's where joy comes from, is him. And I've been on this journey personally related to the gospel in every part of our lives, where I just wanted to confess, in a sense, have not been experiencing the gospel in certain areas of my life the way I used to. And I know we go through seasons, and I want to appreciate the complexity of our minds, our bodies, spiritual attack, social, relational dynamics, weather, some of you. There's a lot of complex factors, but there's one thing God has been putting his finger on in my life that I wanted to share with you. And the reason is it's, I don't think, unique to me. It's a gap between the gospel I know and the power I experience related to that gospel. And it's where we begin to think, or at least I'll speak for myself, think that the good news is just the news. It's the information that I learn, and then I need to keep learning. And then if I can get in on some podcasts, that's even better. And if I need to experience more transformation, I simply need more information. And there's sort of been this treadmill, this academic treadmill, I think, and there's been something missing. And I'll just say what it is that I'm going to unpack a little bit with our time. Simple obedience to what Jesus says. Rather than feeling like I need to understand what all of these Greek words mean, and if I just listen to another thing on it, maybe that'll deepen my understanding, and then I'll even be able to share it with somebody. I could come preach it. Look at that. It's for me coming out from behind the information barrier that I think we get trapped behind in our advice to others, in our social media posts, in my sermons. For example, how many of you, I'll just ask, believe in the importance and the urgency of evangelism? And my question is, how many can say that that urgency shows in the way you live your daily life? Now, I'm not saying this to put any shame or guilt. I'm preaching to myself. But that's that gap where I go, okay, God, I know this. What's missing? What's the gap between the information and the transformational power when we do what Jesus says to do? The best way I can illustrate this is with a song. I grew up in a church, a Baptist church. My dad was the guy who stood up, and there were no guitars. He was just doing this and with his hands for 18 years of my life. That's my memory of my dad, is leading the music. And there was this song we sang like 1,000 times, and it's really cool. We started our time with a reworded version of the song. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. Okay, I loved singing that song. And I think the reason I loved it is because I would be surrounded by a room of people who would be exuberantly like bouncing. On Christ the solid rock I see, you know what I mean? And I'm like, there was something about that song. We'd be singing songs, and then that song would come, and there was like this energy in the room. And I loved singing that song, but the idea that I grew up with as a kid was that standing on Christ the solid rock meant singing that song. That by singing that song, I had suddenly sort of magically transferred myself over to Christ the solid rock, and yay, and I'm better now, I'm good. But it reminded me of, I hope I can share this illustration, the show of The Office. Michael's in some financial trouble, and Creed suggests that he just declare bankruptcy. If you don't know it, don't worry about it. But Michael decides that's a good idea. It's his only option. And so what does he do? He walks out into the office and he shouts, "I declare bankruptcy." And then I think one of the other dudes, Oscar maybe, comes along and says, "Hey, Michael, you can't just declare it. Like, there's actual steps to implement that." You get it? But I think sometimes that's how it can be in the church. We learn the information, we sing songs about the information, we declare it, but nothing's gonna happen until we take those steps to implement it. I was surprised when I finally read the story, and I remember the moment when it hit me as I was reading the story where Jesus does talk about building your house on the rock. Matthew 7, I think Luke 6 also has a parallel version of that. But in Matthew 7, Jesus describes a wise man and a foolish man. And I'll be quick here with this story. But the wise man builds his house on the rock. Foolish man builds his house on the sand, okay? And so he's telling this story. And Jesus outlines, first of all, what really stood out to me originally was the similarities between these men. Because obviously he's drawing a contrast. But the reality is both men were building houses. Both men built houses. Every one of you is building right now. On certain priorities, on certain goals. You are using the raw materials of your daily decisions to build a house. Every one of us is building. The other thing they had in common is they both heard the words of Jesus. As he's telling the story, he's saying they both heard the words of Jesus. In modern time, that would be like saying they were both at church. They both listened to the podcast, right? They had the same information. But for all of their similarities, there was one striking difference that made all the difference. Because as the story continues, it says there was a storm that rose up and it hit those houses, and only the house that was built on the rock survived. And then Jesus explains in verse 24 of that chapter, Matthew 7, he says, "Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock." And I remember the moment it hit me that what made the difference in that guy's life wasn't his knowledge of the words of Jesus. It wasn't his ability to communicate the words of Jesus. It wasn't how many times he was in church, how regularly he attended, whether or not he had sung the song, "On Christ the solid rock I stand." It was only what he did with what Jesus said. And it's fascinating that at the end of the chapter, it says, when Jesus finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. And I love that. I read that and I'm like, isn't that awesome? And then it hits me, that's often though where we stop. In sort of that American Idol culture where we're like, yeah, Jesus, that was like a 9 out of 10. I can't wait till next week. Bring it again. This is awesome. Keep it coming. They were amazed at his teaching, but it struck me that that's not what Jesus was going for. He didn't care who came forward at the end and turned in their notes and said, look, Jesus, look what I wrote down. Now, maybe he would have cared. I shouldn't say that about Jesus. He'd probably said, good job. Now go do it, right? All he wanted was for people who were going to respond to what he said and do it. And I want to be clear, not because it's the right thing to do. And I think sometimes we slip into that. Maybe not as much today. Definitely the church I grew up in, it was right? You do it because. But Jesus was urging them to go put his words into practice. Why? Because he wanted them to have a life that was established. He wanted them to have a regular flow of joy and peace and confidence and assurance that God was with them and God was for them, right? It was all out of love. He wanted them to experience this power that the rest of the world will never know. Because another similarity in this story is both men went through the storm. I think sometimes we have this idea that, Jesus will protect us from that. He'll pluck us out of that. He'll maybe secure our comforts. Both men went through the storm, but only one was taken apart by it. The other one went through that storm. And it's because his beliefs led him to action. That is where the power of the gospel comes alive. And I wanted to share just a couple verses from the New Testament where pictures of the presence and the power and the peace. I didn't mean for those to be 3 P's, but I'm a pastor, so here we go. Of God shows up in ways that it doesn't otherwise when we step out. When we say, Jesus, I don't know what this is supposed to look like. I don't know if I have what it takes, but I'm gonna go. I wanted to share a few verses just as an encouragement to us. John 14, Jesus said to his disciples, you may have heard this, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Now you could read that as some sort of manipulative technique. It could come out that way from someone. If you love me, you'll obey me. This is just the evidence of love. If I say Jesus is the most important person in my life, which I say, does that show in my life? If you love me, if I am your Lord, if I'm your master, if I'm God, you'll obey me, right? Jesus goes on later in that chapter to expound, though, on the benefits of obedience. He says in verse 23, anyone who loves me will obey my teaching, sort of reiterating what he's already said. But then he says this, my Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them. What does that mean? If you have lived it, you know it. You know what it means when Jesus meets you in your step of faith. When you go out of your way to talk to that person that felt like he prompted you to talk to and you didn't know what you were supposed to say, but you were there and you're like, they're with me. That's his promise. Those who obey my teaching, my Father will love them. We will come and we will make our home. And so practically, this isn't just the person who knows the things of God. It's the person who follows through, who takes steps, who says, okay, Lord, what do you want from me today? And I love that picture of making their home. It's if somebody comes and moves in with you, some things change, right? They bring their stuff, they settle in, they maybe even start to spread out. That's what Jesus is saying. You're gonna experience change in parts of your life that maybe you're not right now. But if you step out, I'm gonna show up. The Father's gonna be there, the Spirit's gonna be there. We're gonna make our home. And your house is gonna start to look more and more like me. It's gonna start to reflect my design preferences, right? This is something Paul talks a lot about, the power of putting into practice what we know. Philippians 4 says, and I'll just say this, you've probably heard these words, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Now, I think we can agree that is a challenge in especially our culture today. How do I actually do that? And I grew up in a church where I memorized those words. And I grew up at a time where I felt like that was the goal, was to memorize those words. But Jesus goes on, and Paul adds, whatever you have learned, this is Paul rather, sorry. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. So I love that pairing. I've memorized that line that says, whatever's true, noble, honorable, this, that, think about those things. And I felt like I was just kind of hopeless because there was so much that was not that. And I was like, I don't know how to do that. And he goes on to say, but if you put this into practice, if you just try, the God of peace will be with you. How many of you would say you want that? The God of peace with me, whatever you've learned, received, heard, put it into practice, which by the way is the exact same words Jesus used in Matthew 7 in his story. The man who put his words into practice. Paul adds another phrase, though I don't know if you've noticed, not just whatever you've learned, whatever you received, whatever you've heard from me, but what does he also say? Whatever you've seen in me. It's a little scary, isn't it? See, Paul knew the gospel was more than just information that he was called to stand up and communicate. Words weren't going to change people. They had to see the good news alive. They had to see the transformational power of God. And again, I think I get into this rut of learning and communicating, and it's easy to forget the good news is a transformed life. That you can see, that you can say there's a difference, there's hope for me because look at that. And I think that's why Paul said, whatever you've seen in me, put that into practice. And I love that. If you're feeling like, again, I weave in and out of guilt and shame. I'll just say it of like, oh, I'm not doing enough. I love the word practice. Whatever you've seen, just put it into practice. It's this beautiful, gracious invitation. Just try. Just do something. It's okay. You can't fail. He doesn't say, bring these things to perfection, and then the God of peace will be with you. He says, put these things into practice. And what I want you to hear this morning, God is not waiting to judge you. He's eager to join you. God's not waiting to say, I knew you wouldn't be able to do it. He's like, just practice, right? If you don't know how to play basketball, where do you start? Throw the ball in the general direction of the hoop. And it's embarrassing, and it's funny. And Jesus is like, shoot again. Keep practicing. God is not waiting to judge you. He's ready to join you. He's excited for you taking a step because that's where he comes and makes his home with you. And he says, let's go together. And so when Paul says, whatever you've seen in me, put it into practice. Can you say that to the people in your life? I don't know. It's hard. It's kind of a like reality check, but I think anything that would lead me to say as a follower of Jesus, no, reveals a misunderstanding of what it is I'm called to practice. What is it that what example am I saying? Is it the example of religiosity? Is it the example of perfection? I have sort of got rid of the failures in my life, so now you can follow me and watch me. Is that what Paul was about? Whatever you have seen in me, do the same. He's not based on this religious mindset that I've checked all the boxes and now you can follow me. It's not the illusion of perfection, which many times, without even realizing it, that's what we lead with. Paul was not about that. In fact, one chapter earlier in Philippians, he's talking about the Christian life, pursuing Christ, knowing him, identifying with him in his suffering. And then I love where he says, I don't mean to say that I have already achieved these things or am already perfect, but I press on to make it my own. I keep practicing, because Jesus Christ has made me his own. See, Paul understood so well that he was going to mess up, and yet he still said, follow my example. I haven't figured this out, everybody. I mess up all the time. Put into practice what you see in me. How do those fit together? He's not asking them to follow his failures. He's asking them to follow what he does when he fails. Watch what I do. Watch what I do when I fall down. It's not this Christianese front, it's the practice of the gospel. And I think this is where we sometimes get into trouble in our country, and there's these high-profile leaders that we were convinced were beyond sin. And maybe we put them on pedestals or convince ourselves that they were past a certain point, and then when it comes out that they fail, we're like, they're sinners? And I think it's because we don't practice many times the gospel. We practice performance or religion or something. It's more about the image. But right after Paul says, I have not figured this out, I'm not perfect, he still goes on in verse 17 to say, brothers, join in imitating me. And keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us. Again, not the example of perfection, but watch what I do when I fail. Watch how, because of the gospel of Jesus, I don't have to cover up my sin. Amen? Watch how I don't have to pretend that I am a higher level of Christian than you. Watch how I don't withdraw from God when I fail. I don't pull away from community because Jesus died for my sins. Watch how boldly I can go into the presence of God and find mercy and grace to help in my time of need. Follow that. Do that with me. This is an example that we are all called to set, but we, again, can't do it if we're not stepping out. If the gospel is just the information we learn rather than the power of God that meets us when we step out in our practice. And I wanted to share two practical benefits before we close. And this is one where, in addition to obviously the presence of God and his peace and him making his home with you, I wanted to share a benefit that is for you and then one that is for the people around you. The first one is practicing your faith grows your personal confidence and understanding of what God has done for you. And there's so many examples I was looking at this week. I wanted to just share one. And it's in Philemon chapter 1, verse 6. Paul is writing to Philemon, and he says, I pray that you may be active in sharing your faith so that you may have a full understanding of every good thing we have in Christ. That's his prayer for Philemon. And this is obviously addressing the topic, what we would call evangelism, sharing your faith. But many times we often think of this as finding a window or maybe forcing a window where we can communicate the information. That's what sharing my faith means, is here's the information, but I love how your faith is more than facts about God. It's yours. It's your journey. It's what you've been through. It's your ups and downs. It's the things you hope and dream for. And yes, it's how God meets you in every one of those places. Share that. Share your life with people. But even then, we might think of sharing our faith as being all for the sake of the lost. But what does Paul say? Does he say, I pray you may be active in sharing your faith so that the lost can come to know Jesus? That is absolutely the goal, but what does Paul say? I pray that you may be active in sharing your faith so that you may have a full understanding of every good thing we have in Christ. That's fascinating to me in the way God works, that when we step out and we do what God calls us to do, we deepen in our appreciation of all that God is. As I'm processing my struggles and my faith with another person, come to understand more deeply what Christ has done for me. And I have more confidence and fulfillment in that. There's no better picture of this than when Jesus sent his disciples out to preach the gospel, to heal, to cast out demons. And at one point, he actually sent out 72 of his followers. In Luke chapter 10, he sends out these guys, and I love the instructions he gives them. It's nerve-wracking. There's nobody in that group that wouldn't be left with tons of questions. But what do I do if this happens? But which house do I start with? But what do I say if they say this? Jesus is like, just go. And they're nervous and they have so many questions. There's so many things that could go wrong in their minds. And I love how Jesus doesn't say, all right, you know what, hold on. Let's do a class. And let's get you the information. Now, to be fair, they'd been in school, right? They were with Jesus. He had been talking. They'd been watching him do his thing. But he doesn't say, let's go get you a degree, 4 years, come back, and then I'll send you out and you'll really be confident. He just says, no, I want you to go. He pushes on those insecurities and he pushes them past that point. And the reason is he's not looking for a perfect understanding. He's not looking for perfection or sufficiency. He's just looking for a willingness to go. And I'm talking about sharing our faith, but it can be anything that scares you. It can be anything where you go, I don't know what's going to happen. The beauty of this story is when these guys leave, as I said, I think they probably had all kinds of questions. They're probably talking to each other, trying to figure out what's going to happen. But man, they come back really different people. Verse 17 of Luke 10 says, the 72 returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. Man, do you see what happened there? They go from like calculating, which is where I get trapped in sort of like the but what, and they just go and they do what Jesus says to do, and they come back with a power and a confidence and a conviction that they didn't have before. Jesus, we saw you do things that I've never seen you do before. Because they went, because they obeyed Jesus. So putting our faith into practice deepens our understanding and our confidence, and we grow in that way, and we can't grow without it. But it also gives others an example to follow. And I know I just shared this. The gospel isn't just words that we communicate, it's the example of a person who is being transformed by the power of God. And the world is so desperate to see it, guys. They don't care what we think or believe or sing or say. They want to see it. And we need to see it. And this is where my own journey comes in. And because, again, I'll just be transparent. I teach pretty much every week. And yet in my teaching and my study, which I enjoy, I've slipped. I've gotten lazy in some areas of my life, putting into practice what Jesus says. And I've experienced diminishing power in those areas where there's a gap of the information and the power. And God has reminded me, Micah, building your house on the rock doesn't mean singing that song. Yes, let that song be a catalyst for you. Let it encourage you. It doesn't mean teaching the passage to the church. It means simple, childlike responsiveness to the master. Okay, Jesus, I'll go. I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't know what it's going to cost, but I want to do what you say. And so that's kind of where I wanted to end. I graduated. I grew up and graduated from MSU with music ed. Don't worry, just wait though. Music ed, and then I moved here and I got a master's degree in education. Go Grizz. And so I've heard this statement many times. Many of you may know, those who can't do, teach. I know we've probably all had teachers where you'd say, yeah, that's what's happening here. But I will say it should never, ever, ever be that way in the Christian world. It should never be that way in leadership. And it's such a tempting slope to slide into where people say, wow, I loved that teaching. And I can start to think, oh, so that's it. And Jesus is like, you doing what I say is it. And so as the worship team comes to close us, I wanted to share this character in the Bible. He's one of my favorite guys. At least I think he would be if I knew him. But Ezra, Old Testament, he's a scribe, which means he was the expert. He's the guy people went to if they wanted to know what a verse meant. His primary job was to know and to teach the word of God. And I think it's safe to say that if Ezra had only done those things, if he had only studied and taught the word of God, people would have loved him for it. But Ezra was a man of God. Feel free to push me around, by the way. He was a man of God who knew that there would be no lasting power or impact in his community if he wasn't also himself being transformed. If people weren't seeing the things he was saying lived out in action. And so one of my favorite verses, Ezra 7 verse 9, says the good hand of his God was upon him. Oh man. And anytime I read that, I'm like, Lord, let that be me. Let that be me. Let that be. I actually started by sharing that God's hand is upon this church. But is that some sort of like eeny, meeny, miny, mo superstition? I mean, God is sovereign. He chooses. I believe that. I believe God calls specific people to specific things. But there was no accident to the reason why God's hand was upon Ezra. Because the very next verse says, for Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to do it. And, oh, by the way, to teach his statutes and rules in Israel. This guy had figured it out that to know what God said was important. But then he didn't skip to teaching and say, listen to everyone, what I learned this week. He said, I have to be a man who is being actively transformed by the power of God. And the only way I'm going to be transformed by the power of God is if I do what he says. If I step out, if I live it, and people can see a guy who's willing to make mistakes, who's willing to get his hands dirty, who's willing to set an example. That's when the community is transformed. He knew that. And so he set his heart. He said, Lord, I love those words, because it'd be so easy for him, again, to study and to teach and have the people of God say, wow, would you please always be the guy? And he could have been. But he's like, no, I have to say, time out. I read something from Jesus and I got to go do it. I got to go see what happens. I got to figure out if this is real. Then I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk about that with the people. And I'm going to say, this is it, guys. Trust me. So as we close, I want to give each of us an opportunity to, quote, set our hearts. As Ezra had done, if there's anything where you say, I need to resolve, because if I don't, it's just going to go away. Another translation says he prepared his heart. Another one says he dedicated himself. It is a choice to say, Lord, whatever I hear, Lord, help me do this. Not in an attempt to earn God's favor, but because you already have it because of the blood of Jesus. It's yours, he's yours, and he's not looking to judge you or jump on you. He's ready to join you. And whatever step it is he calls you to take, he's like, I'm gonna be there, and I'm gonna make my home, and I'm gonna spread out into every part of your life. So here's this question. Lord, what do you want me to do? It's pretty intentionally open-ended, so I wanna just close with that, maybe take a minute here of music and quiet for you all to just ask that question to the Lord. And this is a question obviously that bleeds into your afternoon and your week, and allow him to speak at any point he wants to. Let's listen and tune into what he has to say to each of us.